The air conditioning in the boardroom of Sterling and Associates was set to a biting 65 degrees. But the chill in the room had nothing to do with the vents. It radiated entirely from the two people sitting across the massive mahogany table from me. My father, Richard Vance, sat at the head, his hands folded over his silver-topped cane. He wore a $10,000 bespoke suit, his posture rigid, his chest puffed out with the unearned arrogance of a man who had spent his entire life inheriting wealth instead of building it. Next to him was my older sister, Cassandra. She was dripping in diamonds, her fingers oddly twirling a crystal glass of sparkling water, a venomous, self-satisfied smirk plastered across her face. And then there was me. I sat perfectly still, my spine aligned against the leather chair, my hands resting flat on the cold wood. I wore a simple, unbranded black blazer and dark trousers. To them, I looked like a broke, exhausted government clerk who had dragged herself here from some miserable, windowless cubicle. They didn't know that the fabric of my blazer was a customized, fire-retardant Kevlar blend. They didn't know that my resting heart rate was a steady, unbreakable 45 beats per minute, the result of a decade of surviving environments that would have given both of them a fatal panic attack. Cassandra scoffed, the high-pitched, mocking sound slicing through the quiet room. "I still can't believe you had the audacity to show up, Valerie," she said, her voice dripping with artificial pity. She leaned forward, resting her manicured chin on her hand. "Look at you. Did you ride the subway here? You smell like public transit and desperation. Dad, tell her she's wasting her time. She shouldn't even be in this room." Richard didn't look at me. He never looked directly at me if he could help it. He simply adjusted his gold cufflinks, his voice a deep, booming rumble that had terrified me when I was a little girl, but now felt entirely hollow. "Quiet, Cassandra," he commanded, though there was no real anger in his tone. "The law required the firm to notify all living descendants of your grandfather's passing. She has a right to sit there and watch, but that is all she will do. A disappointment of her caliber inherits nothing from a dynasty like ours." I didn't blink. I didn't defend myself. I just watched the slight pulse in my father's jugular vein. 72 beats per minute, I noted mentally. Slightly elevated. He's anxious about the money. I was used to the cruelty. It had been the ambient noise of my entire life. Growing up in the Vance estate, I was the invisible ghost in the grand hallways. Cassandra was the golden child. When she turned 16, Father bought her a European sports car. When I turned 16, I was handed a stack of shift applications for a local diner and told that if I wanted to go to college, I'd better start scraping pennies together. Father funded Cassandra's Ivy League tuition without a second thought, while I spent my nights working 2 jobs, writing essays by the light of a fading laptop screen, and eventually signing my life away to a mysterious government track just to survive. To my family, my career was the ultimate joke. When I joined the service, I had to sign a Tier 1 non-disclosure agreement. My actual life, my training in the mud and blood of elite dark ops camps, my mastery of foreign languages, my psychological conditioning, had to be buried under a heavily fabricated cover story. I told them I took a low-level administrative desk job for the Department of Federal Records. I told them I sorted files, managed logistics, and did data entry. Because my deployments were highly classified and sudden, I would disappear for months at a time, with only a few hours' notice, carrying nothing but a battered canvas duffel bag. They constructed their own narrative about my life. Valerie is a failure. Valerie is a glorified secretary who makes pennies. Valerie misses family birthdays because she's stuck in some depressing government basement archiving dusty paperwork overseas. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, and suddenly I wasn't in the high-rise law firm anymore. I was back at the estate 3 years ago. It was the night of my 25th birthday. I had just stepped off a military transport plane after a harrowing 72-hour extraction mission in a hostile sector of North Africa. I was bleeding from a fresh, poorly stitched laceration on my ribs beneath my shirt. I was exhausted to the bone, my mind still reeling from the smell of smoke and gunpowder. But I had promised myself I would make it to the family dinner. I wanted, just once, to feel like I had a home to return to. I walked into the five-star restaurant, still wearing my wrinkled, travel-worn civilian clothes. The moment I approached the table, the laughter died. Richard looked up, his face hardening with instant embarrassment. Cassandra rolled her eyes so loudly I could hear it. "Look what the wind blew in," Cassandra had laughed, her voice carrying across the quiet, luxury dining room. "The paper pusher returns. Did you fly coach, Val? You look like you slept in a dumpster." "You're late, Valerie." Richard slammed his wine glass down onto the white tablecloth, the deep red liquid sloshing over the crystal rim. This dinner was meant to celebrate Cassandra's new gallery opening. High society people are here. And you walk in looking like a charity case. You are a stain on the reputation of this family. Sit at the far end of the table and keep your mouth shut. Don't speak about your pathetic little job. I won't have my associates knowing my daughter earns less than my gardener. I had stood there, the physical pain in my side throbbing, but the cold numbness in my heart overriding it. I didn't say a word. I sat down. I paid for my own water. And I realized right then that the people sharing my blood were entirely dead to me. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open. Mr. Sterling, the senior partner of the firm, and a man who had handled my grandfather's billions for 40 years, walked in. He looked incredibly grave, his face pale as he carried a thick, leather-bound folder. Behind him were two junior associates, their eyes darting nervously around the room. Cassandra straightened up in her chair, her smirk widening into a victorious grin. She shot me one last venomous look. "Pay attention, Valerie," she whispered harshly. "This is the closest you will ever get to a fortune." Richard cleared his throat, leaning forward, his eyes locked onto the leather folder. "Let's begin, Sterling. My father's empire has been waiting long enough." Mr. Sterling adjusted his glasses, his fingers trembling slightly against the heavy parchment. He cleared his throat again, his voice carrying the forced solemnity of a man delivering a verdict. "To the heirs of Arthur Vance," Mr. Sterling read, his eyes fixed strictly on the page. "Upon my passing, the entirety of the Vance Global Logistics and Real Estate Holdings, valued at a combined $450 million, shall be liquidated and distributed according to my final directives." $450 million. The moment the number left the lawyer's mouth, the atmosphere in the room shifted. It became heavy with the suffocating scent of pure, unadulterated greed. Beside me, Cassandra let out a sharp, ragged gasp. Her eyes went wide, turning glossy as they locked onto the documents. She leaned over toward our father, her high-pitched voice dropping into a feverish, manic whisper that she didn't even realize was loud enough to echo. "Oh my God, Dad, $450 million, she hissed, her manicured fingers digging into the leather armrest. "The estate in Monaco. I can buy the entire hillside, and the yacht we looked at last spring, the 70-meter one. We don't even have to charter anymore." Richard's face flushed a deep, triumphant red. A sickening, predatory smirk spread across his lips as he nodded, his chest swelling. "Quiet, girl," he muttered back, though his own voice was thick with sudden adrenaline. "That's just the liquid capital. The logistics infrastructure alone will give us leverage over the entire eastern shipping corridor. We're untouchable." I watched them. My expression remained a blank, impenetrable mask. Internally, I was running an assessment. Pupils dilated, respiration rapid and shallow, cortisol levels spiking. They looked like junkies staring at a supply. To them, $450 million was a godhood ticket. To me, it was just numbers on a page. I had seen entire regimes collapse over less. I had seen warlords bury twice that amount in the desert dirt just to watch it burn. Please, Mr. Sterling interrupted, his voice tight. He looked visibly uncomfortable, his gaze avoiding the ravenous stares of my family. Let me finish the distribution terms. To my eldest son, Richard Vance, I leave 55% of all liquid assets and primary control of the real estate sector. To my granddaughter, Cassandra Vance, I leave 45% of all liquid assets and secondary shares in the logistics firm. Cassandra practically squealed, throwing her hands to her mouth, her diamonds catching the harsh fluorescent light. Yes, thank you, Grandpa, she cheered, entirely discarding any pretense of mourning. Richard let out a booming, satisfied laugh that shook the quiet room. As it should be, the empire stays in capable hands. And finally, Mr. Sterling's voice suddenly dropped, turning incredibly soft. He looked up from the paper, his eyes locked onto mine. There was a profound, almost tragic sadness in his expression. To my youngest granddaughter, Valerie Vance. The room went dead silent. Cassandra leaned forward, her eyes narrowing into slits, a cruel, mocking smile curling her lips. Richard crossed his arms, his posture turning rigid and dismissive. I leave no monetary compensation, no real estate, and no shares in Vance Global, Mr. Sterling read softly. He reached into a small velvet bag beside his briefcase and pulled out an object, placing it gently on the center of the mahogany table. I leave only this, my original brass military-issue compass, used during my service. It was a battered, heavily tarnished piece of metal. The glass face was scratched, and the leather strap was frayed and rotting at the edges. It looked like garbage sitting on that $10,000 table. A compass? She shrieked, her voice bouncing off the glass walls of the boardroom. She clapped her hands together in pure ecstasy. Oh my God, Valerie, a rusted piece of junk. He left you literal trash. Even a dead man knew you weren't worth a single dime. Richard looked at the compass, and then at me, his face twisting into an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. The booming authority returned to his voice, heavier and more vicious than before. A useless trinket for a useless daughter, Richard snarled, slamming his silver-topped cane onto the floor with a dull thud. He slid a crisp, white legal document across the table toward me, slapping a heavy gold pen on top of it. Sign it, Valerie. It's a total waiver. You relinquish all rights to the inheritance, and more importantly, you officially forfeit your right to use the Vance family name. Sign it. Get out of my sight, and never use my name to beg for scraps again. You don't belong in our world. You are a nobody. I didn't flinch. I didn't reach for the pen. Instead, I calmly reached out, picked up the rusted compass, and wrapped my fingers around the cold, heavy brass. I looked up at the large silver clock mounting the wall. The hands read exactly 2:55 p.m. I took a slow, deep breath, my heart rate remaining a rock-solid 45 beats per minute. I leaned back slightly in my chair and whispered under my breath, just loud enough for the microphone built into my collar to pick it up. 5 minutes early. Richard's brow furrowed. The triumphant smirk on his face began to fracture, replaced by a sudden, volatile confusion. What did you just say? He demanded, his voice rising in anger. Are you deaf? I told you to sign the papers. Look at her, Dad, Cassandra spat, her high-pitched voice rising in irritation. She's completely broken. She's staring at a clock because she's lost her mind. Why aren't you crying, Valerie? You're penniless. You're nothing. Cry for us. My absolute calmness was breaking them. They expected tears, begging, screams of unfairness. They expected me to fall to my knees and plead for a fraction of their wealth. But my silence was a mirror, reflecting their own pathetic insecurity, and it was driving them insane. The tension in the room began to compress, thickening like a physical weight. I am speaking to you, girl, Richard roared, his face darkening with rage as he slammed his fist onto the table. The crystal glasses rattled. "Sign the waiver. I will not have a low-life, impoverished government clerk dragging down the Vance name. If you don't sign it right now, I will have you thrown into the street like the stray dog you are." I didn't answer. I just kept my eyes locked on his, my gaze steel cold, calculating the exact trajectory of his escalating fury. "That's it," Richard growled, turning his head toward the wall-mounted intercom. He slammed his thumb onto the button. "Security, get up to the 41st floor boardroom immediately. We have a trespasser who needs to be forcibly removed from the premises." "Move." Cassandra folded her arms, her chest heaving with malicious glee. "You brought this on yourself, Val. Enjoy the ride down to the gutter." The silence returned, but it wasn't peaceful. It was a pressure cooker, the air growing thinner by the second. I held the rusted compass tightly in my palm, feeling the steady tick of the clock counting down the seconds. The boardroom doors were about to open, and my family had absolutely no idea that the trap they thought they had set for me was about to snap shut on them. "Ma'am," the larger guard said, his voice flat and unyielding, "your father has asked you to leave. Please step away from the table, or we will have to escort you out." I didn't answer. I didn't move a single muscle. Richard crossed his arms, leaning back with a cold, triumphant sneer. "Don't just stand there looking at her. Drag her out. Throw her into the alley for all I care. She's no daughter of mine." The two guards stepped forward, their heavy hands clamping down tightly onto my shoulders. I felt the pressure of their grip. To a civilian, it would have been terrifying. To me, it was laughably amateurish. I could have snapped both of their wrists in under 2 seconds. But I didn't. I just kept my eyes locked on the silver wall clock. 2:59:58, 2:59:59, 3:00. The guards froze, their grips loosening instantly as their heads snapped up toward the ceiling. In an instant, the room plunged into near darkness before the emergency backup systems kicked in. Heavy crimson-red hazard lights pulsed from the corners of the ceiling, bathing the entire luxury boardroom in a bloody, surreal glow. The shadows danced wildly against the mahogany table. On the desk, Mr. Sterling's high-end digital telephone screen flashed a blinding bright red, screaming with violent static, before going completely dead. "What the hell is going on?" Richard roared, his booming voice cracking with a sudden sharp edge of panic. He slammed his hands onto the table, struggling to stand. "Sterling, why are the alarms going off? Jenkins, get on your radio. Find out what's happening to my building." The security guard tried to unclip his radio, his fingers shaking, but before he could even press the button, a cold, unfeeling electronic voice overrode the entire building's PA system. "Warning, airspace compromised. Level 1 federal tactical lockdown initiated. All civilian communication lines are severed. All civilian personnel remain grounded. Do not attempt to leave the building. Seek immediate cover." "Airspace compromised?" Cassandra shrieked, her high-pitched voice piercing through the alarms. She stumbled backward, her expensive high heels slipping on the polished floor. "Dad, what does that mean? Are we being attacked?" "Look," Cassandra screamed, pointing a trembling, diamond-encrusted finger at the floor-to-ceiling windows. Out in the open sky, slicing directly through the low-hanging clouds, 3 massive matte-black Sikorsky UH-60 Blackhawk helicopters dropped into view. They carried no markings, no logos, and no flags. They hovered effortlessly right outside our window, their giant rotor blades spinning with a deafening fury that pushed a wall of air directly against the skyscraper. Cassandra let out a blood-curdling scream, dropping to her knees and covering her head as the intense acoustic pressure vibrated right through our chests. Richard tripped over his own silver-topped cane, crashing heavily into his leather chair, his face losing every single ounce of its color. He looked like a ghost. "They're coming for us," the lawyer, Mr. Sterling, whimpered, his eyes wide with paralyzing terror as he clutched his grandfather's will to his chest like a shield. "Oh God, we're being kidnapped. It's a terrorist attack. The two corporate security guards reached for their holstered handguns, but they never even got the chance to unclip them. Thick, acrid gray smoke poured through the shattered doorway, smelling heavily of sulfur and burnt cordite. Through the haze, a blinding array of crimson and neon green infrared laser sights sliced through the red emergency lights, tracing across the walls like a deadly spiderweb. 12 figures moved into the room with terrifying lethal speed. They were elite special forces operators, clad from head to toe in matte black, heavy ballistic Tier 1 armor. Their faces were completely hidden behind dark tactical respirators and ballistic visors, with quad-lens night vision goggles flicked up on their helmets. In their hands they held suppressed submachine guns and tactical assault rifles, weapons raised and scanning. "Clear right," a deep, modulated voice barked through a comms unit. The two corporate security guards immediately dropped to their knees, throwing their hands into the air, weeping in terror. One of the operators stepped forward, effortlessly taking their weapons away into the corner. Richard was hyperventilating, his hands shaking so violently he couldn't even stand up. He backed himself into the far corner of the room, his billionaire arrogance completely erased, leaving only a pathetic, trembling old man. "Take whatever you want," he begged, his voice cracking, tears of absolute terror welling in his eyes. "I have millions. Take the money. Just don't kill us. Please don't kill us." Cassandra was curled into a fetal position on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably into the expensive carpet, completely paralyzed by the overwhelming military presence. The 12 operators completely ignored them. They didn't look at Richard. They didn't look at Cassandra. They didn't look at the lawyer. Instead, they moved in a flawless, synchronized tactical sweep directly toward the center of the room. They bypassed the shivering civilians and formed a tight, impenetrable, outward-facing ironclad circle. Weapons raised outward, protecting the perimeter. Protecting me. None of the red or green laser sights touched my body. I sat perfectly still in the center of their tactical phalanx, the rusted brass compass resting calmly in my open palm. Through the thick smoke, the operators stood like unyielding statues of steel and shadow. My family lay broken and weeping on the floor, utterly convinced they were facing their executioners, completely unaware that the impoverished secretary they had just disowned was the sole reason these gods of war had just descended upon the room. Through the haze of gray sulfur and the pulsing crimson glow of the emergency lights, the wall of armored operators suddenly shifted. With absolute, machine-like synchronization, the 12 heavily armed men stepped backward, parting down the center to form a perfect, rigid corridor. Walking through the smoke was a man who looked like he had been sculpted from granite. He wore a pristine, dark blue military dress uniform, the fabric sharp and unwrinkled despite the chaos outside. Pinned to his collar were 4 gleaming silver stars that caught the red hazard light, the emblem of a 4-star general of the United States military. It was General Marcus Vance, a legendary member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and one of the most powerful military minds on the planet. Flanked closely on either side of him were 4 stone-faced federal agents in sharp black suits, their hands hovering near their jackets, carrying heavy, carbon fiber briefcases secured with biometric locks. The moment my father saw the silver stars, a desperate, pathetic spark of hope ignited in his eyes. He recognized the general. Of course he did. General Vance was a frequent figure on international news. Richard scrambled to his feet, using his silver-topped cane to steady his trembling legs. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead, puffing out his chest in a desperate attempt to reclaim his billionaire status, completely misreading the situation. General Vance," Richard stammered, his booming voice cracking with a high-pitched, terrified desperation as he stepped forward, his hands shaking. "Thank God you're here. My family, we are being threatened by these men. They breached my building. I am Richard Vance, CEO of Vance Global Logistics. I demand to know what is." General Vance didn't even turn his head. He didn't blink. He treated the billionaire tycoon like an invisible ghost, walking straight past him. The draft from the general's heavy wool coat literally brushed against Richard's expensive suit, sending the old man stumbling back a step in sheer shock. Right to where I sat. I remained seated, my spine perfectly straight, my fingers loosely draped over the grandfather's rusted brass compass. General Vance stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me. He brought his heels together with a sharp, echoing snap. Slowly, deliberately, he removed his military cap, tucked it under his left arm, and raised his right hand to his brow, executing a flawless, deeply reverent, and unbreakable military salute. The 12 armored operators around the room instantly snapped to attention, their weapons held across their chests in perfect salute. General Vance opened his mouth, his booming, gravelly voice echoing off the shattered glass windows with the force of thunder. "Commander Vance reporting, ma'am," the general declared. His eyes locked onto mine with profound respect. "Cyber intelligence intercepted a Level 5 high-priority threat against your current coordinates. The Sector 9 Shadow Fleet has been secured, and the airspace above this city is now under our total tactical control. We have locked down the entire grid. We are ready for your orders, Commander." Mr. Sterling, the senior legal partner, completely lost his grip. His expensive gold-plated fountain pen slipped from his paralyzed fingers, bouncing off the mahogany table and rolling uselessly onto the floor. His eyes were wide, bulging from his skull, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Beside him, Cassandra's sobbing stopped instantly. Her entire body went rigid. Her jaw literally hung open, her mind completely fracturing under the weight of what she had just heard. She stared at me, her eyes darting from my simple black blazer to the rows of elite Tier 1 soldiers saluting me, and then to the 4-star general standing at attention before her broke loser sister. And Richard, my father's face didn't just turn pale, it turned a sickening hollow ash gray. The silver-topped cane slipped from his hand, clattering loudly against the ground. He took a staggered step back, his knees buckling slightly as his brain violently rejected the reality crashing down upon him. The psychological collapse was total. For 10 years they had mocked me. For 10 years they had called me a secretary, a paper pusher, an impoverished embarrassment who spent her life in a dark basement sorting government files. They had just cut me out of a $450 million inheritance, believing they were throwing me into the gutter. And now they were realizing the terrifying truth. The basement data entry clerk was a myth, a shadow. I wasn't an outcast. I was the ghost of the Pentagon. I was the supreme commander of the nation's most lethal, highly classified Black Ops unit. A woman who didn't just sort files, but decided the fates of nations with a single word. I slowly let my gaze drift from the general down to my father. I didn't look at him with anger. Anger is an emotion you waste on an equal. I looked at him with the cold, absolute indifference of a god looking down at an insect. "At ease, General," I said softly, my voice completely calm, cutting through the heavy silence of the room like a razor blade through silk. General Vance lowered his hand, his expression ironclad. "Thank you, ma'am." Richard finally found his voice, though it was no longer booming. It was a pathetic, high-pitched, trembling whisper, his lips shaking so violently he could barely form the words. "Valerie," he breathed, his chest heaving as he stared at me in sheer, unadulterated horror. "What is this?" I slowly pushed my chair back. I stood up. In that single, fluid motion, the entire room seemed to lose what little oxygen it had left. I stood perfectly straight, my shoulders square, my chin held high. The quiet, reserved posture of the outcast daughter vanished entirely, replaced by the lethal, commanding presence of a woman who had looked down the barrels of 100 rifles and never blinked. I didn't look at my father. I didn't look at my sister. They didn't exist to me anymore. I turned my head slightly toward General Vance. Valerie, please." Richard staggered forward, his hands outstretched, his face covered in a pathetic mixture of tears and sweat. The booming, arrogant tycoon was completely gone. In his place was a desperate, terrified old man clawing at the air. "Sweetie, listen to me. We didn't know," he cried, his voice trembling violently, cracking under the weight of his panic. "It was a mistake. A horrible, terrible misunderstanding. The family. We're a family, right? The inheritance. Forget what the will said. We can split it evenly. 50-50. No, 60-40. Whenever you want, Valerie. Just tell your men to stand down." Cassandra scrambled up from the floor, clutching at the edge of the mahogany table, her eyes wide and manic. Yes, Val, I'm sorry. I was just joking earlier. You know I love you. We can share everything. The mansions, the yachts, it's all yours." I slowly turned my head, my eyes locking onto my father's. The absolute deadness in my gaze stopped him mid-sentence. He froze, his mouth half open, a cold shiver visibly running down his spine. "To you I am not Valerie," I said, my voice cutting through their frantic whimpering like a sheet of ice. "I am Commander Shadow, and you just asked me to sign away my association with your family." I picked up the crisp white legal document Richard had slid across the table earlier, the one meant to strip me of my last name. I let it slip from my fingers, watching it drift uselessly onto the floor. "Thank you for making that easy." "Commander," General Vance's voice boomed, stepping forward and drawing everyone's attention back to the federal agents behind him. The general reached into the briefcase, pulling out a thick, heavily stamped black dossier. He opened it, his eyes scanning the documents with an unyielding, bureaucratic coldness. He looked up, fixing his gaze directly on my trembling father. "Commander, per your ongoing investigation into illegal offshore asset shielding," General Vance announced, his voice echoing with absolute finality, "we have found undeniable evidence that Richard's logistics empire has been laundering money for sanctioned foreign entities. Under the National Security Act, his entire $450 million empire is officially seized by the federal government, effective immediately." The words hit the room like a physical shockwave. Cassandra let out a weak, choked gasp. Her eyes rolled into the back of her head, her knees giving out completely as she fainted, her body hitting the expensive carpet with a heavy, ungraceful thud. Richard didn't even notice her fall. His face went entirely hollow. His eyes glazed over as $450 million, his godhood, his fortress, his entire identity vanished into thin air in less than 10 seconds. His legs buckled. He dropped heavily to his knees, his hands clamping onto his head as he began to weep uncontrollably, the tears soaking into his $10,000 suit. No, please," Richard begged, looking up at me, his chest heaving as he sobbed like a child. "Valerie, save me. They'll put me away for life. I'm your father. You command them. Tell them it's a mistake. Please, have mercy on me." I looked down at him on the floor. I felt no anger. I only felt a profound, chilling indifference. "Mercy is for civilians, Richard," I said softly. "In my world, we only deal in consequences." I leaned down, my hand brushing past the useless legal documents, and picked up the battered, tarnished brass compass my grandfather had left me. I wiped a layer of dust from its scratched glass face. The needle spun truly, pointing north. It was the only thing in this entire tower built on blood money that possessed any real value. The only thing that mattered. I slid the compass deep into the pocket of my Kevlar-lined blazer. "General Vance," I commanded, turning my back on my weeping father. "Clear the room. Hand the targets over to the federal marshals for processing. We are done here." "Right away, Commander," General Vance barked. I turned and began walking toward the shattered, smoke-filled exit. As I stepped over the ruined oak doors, Richard's desperate, echoing screams followed me down the hallway, muffled by the pulsing red emergency sirens. "Valerie, come back! Please, Valerie!" But Valerie was dead. Only the commander remained. My family spent my entire life looking down on me. They thought power was measured by the size of a bank account, the cut of a suit, or the luxury of a mansion. They thought that because I walked in the shadows, I was weak. They forgot that the shadows are where the apex predators hunt. They wanted to cast me out into the dark. They didn't realize that the dark belongs to me. Let them weep in the ruins of the empire they built on lies. Let them look up from the dirt to see the daughter they disowned, ruling the world from the shadows.